Welcome to The Writing Life, the podcast for anyone who writes. I'm Steph McKenna, Senior Communications and Marketing Manager.
And I'm Holly Ainley, Head of Programmes and Creative Engagement here at NCW.
And we're broadcasting from Dragon Hall in Norwich, UNESCO City of Literature.
In today's podcast, NCW's Chief Exec Peggy Hughes is joined by author and professional campaigner Sarah Corbett to discuss craftivism, a form of activism and collective empowerment that is centred on practices of craft. Sarah is an activist, author, speaker, and the founder of Craftivist Collective. She's known for developing the gentle protest approach to activism, which is activism that is slow, attractive, kind, strategic, and deeply engaging. She is the author of 3 books on craftivism, and her new book, The Craftivist Collective Handbook, was just published this May.
Together, Peggy and Sarah discuss the new book, which features instructions for 20 craftivism projects and delves into the methodology on gentle craftivism. They also touch on how craft can provoke people to think about social change, the links between craftivism and well-being, and how social media enabled Sarah to build a strong community of craftivists. Sarah will also be joining us at National Centre for Writing in July to deliver an event and workshop on becoming a gentle craftivist. Holly, tell us more.
Happily, really excited that Sarah's going to be with us in Norwich, as you say, in July, Saturday the 13th of July, over the course of a morning. And it's an opportunity for you, if you're interested, to learn the theory and the practice of positive change making. So it's really about the why and the how of this craftivist movement that Sarah has developed. And she'll be looking at how it came to be and why she was led to this sort of work, but also how her gentle protests through craftivism projects has really helped to make positive change, but change in a very slow and gentle way. So if you come along, there'll be a talk and Q&A session with Sarah around the new book, and then an opportunity to take part in 2 very different craftivism projects yourself. All the materials will be provided and no craft skills are actually needed. This will just be a really relaxed and friendly environment, an opportunity for you to meet like-minded people. Just need to come with an open heart and an open mind.
This sounds like a very uplifting and inspiring event, and I'm sure it will be popular. So if you'd like to grab a ticket, do head over to the National Centre for Writing website at nationalcentreforwriting.org.uk and visit the What's On page. So now on to the main portion of today's episode, and I'm very happy to hand over to Peggy Hughes in conversation with Sarah Corbett.
You're back in Norwich, Sarah. This is so lovely. We had you here in 2018, I think, last time. Here with us.
Yeah, with the young people who were amazing.
They were amazing. Part of our Engage project many moons ago.
Yeah, it was really good.
But of course, you and Norwich have history, family connections, which is nice.
Yeah. My granddad was Bishop of Norwich. And him and my nan, both of their ashes are in the cathedral with little plaques. And my mum was married to my dad, obviously, in the cathedral as well. Oh. So her brother walked her down the very long cathedral aisle, and her dad married my parents. And she was really worried her heel was going to get stuck in one of the grids.
The little grids, little cattle grids.
Yeah. And then the wedding party was in the bishop's house garden.
Oh, delightful.
So lots of memories.
Lots of nice memories in Norwich. And we're discussing today this amazing book that I've seen only in a very proof state.
And
so this is beautiful.
I've just snuck in a hard physical copy.
Tell our listeners what are we looking at here, this delightful thing?
This is a square project book called the Craftivist Collective Handbook, 20 projects, including essays on how to do each project, so the why to as well as the how to, some collage pages of people who've already taken part, and sort of the methodology of gentle protest craftivism.
This is not your first book.
It's not my first rodeo. No, I've got 3 others, but this is sort of like complements all of them, and is the only multicoloured project book.
Beautiful looking book, and we will get into the sort of the weeds of the book, if we want to put it that way. But before we do that, I think it would be really interesting and useful to talk a little bit more about craftivism, because I suspect some of our listeners will know what that is, and perhaps even be practicing craftivists themselves.
There's a few in Norwich.
Yeah, so that to those people, you can do the dishes at this juncture. But in seriousness, I think it sort of would be useful to unpack, what do we mean when we say craftivism? What indeed is that, and where did it come from?
For most people who haven't heard the term before, it is super niche. It was coined in 2003 by an American lady called Betsy Greer, who's a knitter, loves knitting, and she was in London at the time doing a sociology master's degree, and was joining lots of knitting groups, and was thinking, this isn't just knitting, this is mostly women, often talking about politics, talking about make, do and mend, talking about capitalism, community. So for her, she was like, there's more to this than just craft. So she coined the word craftivism and defines it very broadly as it's a way for people to express their experience and show their commitment and passion for social change. I only found out about craftivism on a train to Glasgow in 2008, where I was doing some cross stitch. I'd never done any before, but I missed making stuff with my hands, and I was on a train journey where I get too travel sick to read or write or do work. And I noticed that the process slowed me down, calmed me down, and I was feeling like a very burnt out activist at the time, and doubting whether I could do activism as an introvert and someone who doesn't like conflict. And the process helped me grapple with quite big questions and helped me be strategic. And then the people opposite me were asking me what I was doing, and I thought, oh, normally in Britain we don't talk to strangers. And my immediate thought, because my background in activism, was, oh, if only I was cross-stitching a quote about Gandhi and inequality, we could talk about it. So I Googled craft and activism, thinking, I think this could be an interesting fit. The word existed, the phrase did, but there wasn't any projects or groups I could join. So I contacted Betsy Greer,
and where was she
emailed her.
At this point?
She was back in America, and said, are there any projects? Can I use the word? And she's very generous and said, anyone can use the word in whatever way you want. So I started using the term, but figured within a few years, really figured out that for me, the strength of craftivism isn't just the tool of craft, but it's about gentleness and using it in lots of different ways to make effective long-term change. I'm rambling.
No, you're not.
You're cut in at any point.
I will, and you're not.
But I guess my point is, if you Google craftivism, there's lots of different ways you can do it. So I always say it's a little bit like the word punk. If you think of punk music, you've got all these different bands and different musicians who sound very different, but they're under that umbrella. And craftivism, I think we need to see as the same. My approach I call gentle protest, but you've got some ungentle approaches. You've got some people, I use a lot of text in our craftivism, other people don't. Some is more fundraising and awareness raising. So so I call my approach gentle craftivism.
Gosh, there's heaps of stuff, and I'm listening to you and thinking, where do we go in this conversation next? Because you've said about 1,000 brilliant things.
That's why I wrote the book, love, because there's so much to say.
A lot to say. In the very immediate term, I want to know, why were you cross-stitching, having never crossed? Why was that your craft of choice that day?
Well, I think that's one of the many benefits of handicraft, is it's accessible. So I used to draw and paint as a kid. I was always that weird little shy one in the corner, very happy for hours doing my own thing, and then presenting my parents very odd things, going, look what I've made. And they'd be very sweet and go, that's lovely, dear. Maybe pin it up on the wall. Nice. And I get travel sick on when I'm trying to read and write reports and stuff on those Pendolino trains. And I live in London, so my train journey to Glasgow I knew was going to be 5.5 hours. And I just thought, I'm so knackered in my job as a professional campaigner and in my personal life, joining lots of activist groups. So I thought, I can't do my work. So, but I also don't like drawing and painting in front of people. I sort of hide it, and you can't paint on a train because it'll get everywhere. So I was in a little boutique where I lived, and they just had a £5 cross-stitch kit, which was very small, could fit in your pocket, of a teddy bear. And I'd never cross-stitched before, but because it's just X's, and one of the great strengths of handicrafts is it is accessible, whether you've done it before or not. I just felt like this is something I could do to calm me down, use my hands, pass the time, and not be on the internet all the time or tapping away all the time. And I could YouTube how to thread a needle. So it just innately felt like something easy, not too pressury, pass the time. But I had no idea it was going to turn into what it is now.
Your career.
My job. Yeah.
Wild.
Yeah.
Wild. I think I want to ask you a little bit about that idea of being, well, not an idea, it was the case for you that you were an activist who was burnt out, and how craftivism flies in the face of that. It's a much more gentle kind of mode. Why is activism such a thing that burns folk out? What is it? What is it about that?
Well, my background in activism, so I grew up in Everton in Liverpool, in the 80s and 90s, when my dad was the local vicar, my mum was a nurse and then a community worker, and then became the local politician. And our kitchen in the vicarage was where most of the activism meetings were in the community, whether we were campaigning to save local housing or get a health centre, or whether we were campaigning on national issues, or even South Africa apartheid and boycotting oranges and buying fair trade coffee. Our home was very much full of people of all faiths and none campaigning on social change. So I grew up seeing how injustice was on our doorstep and out in the world, and very much that it's, as our family as Christians, but also just as humans, that we should stand up where we see injustice, and we should try and be part of solutions, not problems. So that's always been part of me. But a lot of the channels growing up, but also more so when I joined activist groups later on as a teenager and in university, and becoming a professional campaigner, which is sort of the only job I'm qualified to do, because that's what my life has been about. A lot of the ways we encourage people to join is saying, you should be really angry about this. Now use your anger to react, and do these big campaigns. So grab a megaphone and do something. Come and do this intervention. They're often very visual, one-off media events. Go on a big march, make as much noise as possible. And yes, we need all those points. And I was joining lots of groups where that was the default of what we should do as activists. So it was always reactive. It was always a badge of honour to be angry and be upset and just sort of react in that way. But growing up, I knew that that wasn't the only way of doing activism, and it wasn't the only successful way. Sometimes it was more harmful and helpful. We had lots of meetings in our house where I would be sitting there as a small child listening in about how the community had targeted the wrong power holder and they had to go find the right one, or they had unusual allies with people, and lots of quiet meetings that weren't shared on social media now or in the media. But a lot of the actions we're told to do are either big and loud and extrovert, which as an introvert is quite hard, very combative and polarising or demonising, which I don't agree with, and is a short-term way to do things. But a lot of people, not just introverts, get burnt out, but when you're talking about people being goodies and baddies, and when you're saying we want quick, simple solutions, that isn't how the world works. And then people get annoyed that they can't see quick change. And we're constantly in this fight or flight or freeze mode of chronic stress and reactive rather than proactive. So like a lot of people who get involved in activism, I burnt out really quickly because I couldn't see quick change to our quick slogans. I think it's better now, but at the time we didn't talk about self-care. I don't think the phrase existed really in the 2000s. It was very much a badge of honour of you burn yourself out because you believe in the cause, rather than actually I need to take a step back and then do what I can and be more pragmatic. So yeah, I burnt out and I couldn't find groups that were a bit more compassionate or that offered tactics that were more slower and thoughtful and quiet. The activism was either clicktivism or slacktivism or quick angry activism. And I just immediately saw craft as another tool to add to the toolkit of activism, not to replace other forms, but to say actually sometimes we need to channel our emotions into something effective, and craft process can help with that and help with critical thinking. Sometimes we need to build relationships with people we disagree with and use that as a way to gently protest them. Other times we need to do more reactive stuff, but we need all these different forms.
Yeah. And I think the book really articulates that almost that activism can be, for everyone can participate in activism in a sense that, you know, I think everything you've just said can really alienate people or make them feel I can't be part of that march or I can't raise my voice, you know.
And we need all of it. So sometimes I do go on a march if it's got a clear aim that's realistic and isn't focused on personality over policies, of, you know, focused on someone's haircut or rather than, you know, changing a certain law or policy. But other times I'll say, well, my sister's an extreme extrovert. She's really good at that stuff. She can do that. And I won't feel guilty if I'm doing another form of activism that complements the big marches.
You just mentioned social media, which made me think, I was thinking this as I was reading the book, that it feels to me there is a lot of outrage on social media and it isn't, you know, it's quite, it can be a very polarised and polarising place. But it seems to me that certainly, well, Instagram, for example, seems a great place to, it's a nurturing space for a lot of these sorts of, you know, makers and crafters. It would seem, I'm thinking of an account, your account, obviously, accounts like Public Quilts, if people thought, you know, do you want to say a little bit about this? Do you think there's a new space opening up on social media for this sort of...
If you ask me on different days, I'll give you different answers. I definitely, like, I started doing Craftivist Collective in 2009 as a hobby because people wanted to join in my little projects. And at that time, Instagram didn't exist, but Facebook did. And then slowly Instagram and Pinterest and Twitter. And I had a blog. I wouldn't be where I am today, where Craftivist Collective is my full-time job, without social media and without media. Our images are really visual and beautiful and small and unusual, and they're not demonizing, but they are there to provoke people to think about social change and what they can do. So they've got a lot of media and social media and being shared that way. And what I love about social media, and I loved compiling. I spent so long going through all of my Instagram and social media posts that I shared of other craftivists' voices from around the world and seeing what everyone how people had found our projects useful in different ways and including them in the book. So whether they're images or quotes or tweets and it really reminded me that it was a community. I didn't plan to set up a collective, but people wanted to join in, whether they were craft lovers or introverts or burnt out activists, a real mix from around the world. And I still love it now where I see people connect on social media. Sometimes they meet up in real life, which I'm really excited about as one of the excuses with a book is to do lots of events. And that's a lovely way I see craftivists meet each other in real life as well, which is lovely. So I think I'm really clear with how I want people to use Craftivist Collective projects on social media. I tell people to share their crafter thoughts. So what are they thinking while they're crafting? And I have questions for them to reflect on. I get them to share their process if and when they want, to encourage and intrigue other people to join them on their journey or take part themselves. But I'm really careful, and I've included in the book what colours to use, what fonts to use, what language to use, so it's not divisive or oversimplistic or preaching at people, which is very easy to do on social media. And our projects are not as popular or won't have as many likes as some of the forms of craftivism, which are much more simple to understand and simple to go, I agree or disagree with it. Ours are much more about asking questions than giving answers, or taking people on a journey of, here's an issue, here's different ways that you can take part in solving it. And that isn't something that's easy to click and share as much as other more simplistic craftivism projects. But I think the more simplistic ones are more harmful because it doesn't address the fact that social change is complex, is nuanced, is contextual, and there isn't normally a silver bullet to fix it.
Is that stuff that had occurred to you, you know, right at the very beginning of your craftivism journey, you know, the kind of almost, you know, that devising something that was complex enough to leave people with that sort of set of prompts or that sort of outcome? Do you know what I mean? Like,
no.
I mean, how much was yeah.
Well, I think I think anyone, especially crafters, know that we learn from doing. I mean, we all know it, don't we? You can read all the theory of something, but you then have a go and you learn from the mistakes more than the perfect things. So my first project, which is in the book, is mini protest banners. You cross-stitch them, because I learned cross-stitch on the train to Glasgow, and they're postcard-sized little mini banners, and you hang them below eye level, somewhere relevant to the issue that's part of street art. So if you are concerned about the ethics of a fast fashion brand, you might hang it outside a shopping centre or near where that shop is. Or if you're concerned about extreme capitalism, you might put it near a banking sector where bankers walk past, and you've got a nice visual of explaining a bit more about how you want people to just think about what these issues are. And I learned from doing. Some of it was innate of, if I do it small, people have to go and read it rather than it being forced in your face. And the neuroscience I know now, with the help of the neuroscientist in the book, Dr. Danby Kim from MIT, I knew that if people had to go up, they're more likely to have an open heart and an open mind to read it than if they're forced with a banner on your face. But I didn't know the neuroscience behind it. And the same with language of stitching a handkerchief for my local politician, saying, don't blow it, use your power for good. I know you've got a difficult job, but a really important one. I want to encourage you in your role. I sort of felt that that was respectful and humble and encouraging, but I didn't know the positive psychology behind the words I was using and the fonts I was using. So it's been an amazing learning curve, and I have been constantly tweaking the projects, adding bits in, taking bits out, changing the shapes we use and the fonts we use, learning from my mistakes and from all the reading I do on activism strategy and neuroscience and psychology and typography. All of that stuff is in the book from all of the learning I've done over the last decade and a half.
Yeah. Well, we are going to talk much more about the book in a second. Before we move on from, I suppose, the big zoomed out view on craftivism in general, I did want to ask, you've talked in there about various campaigns or you said issues that you've sort of put your attention on. And I think this is a quote from the book. Sort of a prompt, if you like, for readers. What dreams do you have for our world that stir you up to the point that you can't ignore them? And I suppose I wanted to ask you, where do you choose to put your energy? How do you decide which campaigns to back or which issues to tackle?
It's really hard, and I think I've learned again from mistakes of trying to do it all, and then feeling really guilty, and then burning out as a craftivist, which is ironic and not helpful for people trying to join. So it's a balance for all of us, I think, of trying to be as pragmatic as possible, of being realistic. Where have I got influence? Where do I not have influence? Where can I use my gifts and talents and circle of influence for best use, and where is it not helpful? And then some of the projects in the book you can link in with your own issue, like the mini protest banners. Some are issue specific, like the Canary Craftivism project is a climate campaign. And some you can have a go at and go, okay, well, I've learned from doing that issue specific campaign. Now I can use that experience and knowledge to create my own campaign, which is the last chapter on how to do your own. It's a real mix, and it's strange. This is where I sound a little bit like woo-woo. Some projects I feel like a conduit for. Some projects sort of appear in my mind for a particular issue, and I go, oh, that's interesting. I figure out how it can be of use. And then other times I'll see that there's a gap within a particular group of people. So I work a lot. I prioritise working with people who've never done activism before, or who are nervous of activism, or who are apolitical or part of different political parties, where some campaign groups would find it harder to engage with. And then I figure out a project to engage them. So it's really sort of like a juggling act of where can I have most influence? What are the issues that realistically I can have impact on? And is there a gap that I think gentle craftivism can complement other activism rather than replace it or compete with, or all doing the same thing when we're not needed? It's a real mix. I don't think that answers your question.
I think it really does, actually. It confirms that
I'm much more succinct in the book.
No. Well, it just confirms that there's no one size fits all. It's not a straightforward thing. I think it's interesting to anyone hopefully listening. Certainly, just where do you put your energy today?
Exactly. And sometimes I'll do a project where I say, just come to this event and we just need you for that. And other times it's saying, make this object for yourself as a physical reminder for you to change your own habits and attitudes and not be on autopilot. So every project's got very different objectives and different results, depending on who you are, where you live, your background, your circle of influence, the context you're in. Like it is, I think that's why people struggle with activism. It isn't a silver bullet. It isn't, here's a recipe of how to do it and you will make a perfect campaign, just like you'll make a perfect cake with this cake recipe. It's complex and it's messy, and that's what can put people off or burn people out or confuse people, and that you get so overwhelmed you don't do anything, or you try and do everything and you burn out. So my hope with the book is to say, have a go at these projects, learn from doing. You're doing projects that will have impact with their own objectives, but it also might help you think through how you can be an activist in other areas, or how you can protest gently when someone at the bus stop says something xenophobic, or something's happening at work and you're not sure how to address it. I hope that it is a catalyst for change.
This is my big awkward segue into talking more about it. It's a quote from the book, but you say, we need to strive to be skilled wordsmiths more than skilled craftspeople in our gentle craftivism, which I did want to zone in on just briefly about how you choose the words that you're using, but then to zoom out and talk a bit more about your process as a writer as well as a crafter. So could we take that first, just that idea of the skilled wordsmith over being a skilled craftsperson in the creation of something? How do you choose the right words when you've only got such a tiny canvas?
Yeah, I think people find that the hardest. And a lot of what I say in the book is quite countercultural or a little bit topsy-turvy. Sometimes people go, oh, what? That seems the opposite of our default thinking of do small and beautiful, not big and loud, or have less people involved than more people involved. It is quite surprising for people. And that comment, I hope, does sort of wake the reader up to go, what? And reread it. So a lot of people who love craft go, well, I found what to do with my activism. And I have to say, don't have craft as your taskmaster. You know, it needs to serve the cause, which is on the manifesto. And that some crafters get a little bit annoyed that they can't just do loads and loads of craft that they love for a cause. It's about quality, not quantity. And actually, if it's so delicate and beautiful and perfect, one of the joys of craft is it can be imperfect and it's handmade, so it shouldn't be completely perfect, which means whoever sees it or receives it or touches it knows that a human's made it and not a robot's made it, which is why it's all handicraft, not machine embroidery or 3D printing or anything like that. With the words, so actually the imperfections make it more endearing and more engaging and disarming and more connecting for people, which if you think of a lot of activism, people want to discredit what you're saying because they feel judged. And with the craft, it's a much more loving and human way and a vulnerable way to say, I really care about this. And, you know, I hope you do too. And I've made this thing, which isn't perfect, but it shows my commitment to the cause. The words are the hardest because people say, oh, I'm naturally gentle. I'm not. I'm very angry at injustice. I scream into pillows. I dance out my anger. I cry constantly. I limit how much news I read because I'm not a gentle person. So the craftivism is really helpful to channel your anger and sadness and reaction into something effective. And the hardest thing for people to do is often that process. So sometimes I say to people, stitch around the edges of your craftivism project, or while you're cutting out, or while you're doing something that's not text-based, think about what words you're going to use. So turn your statement on your mini banner into a question, or can you use a fact and have ... at the end, and where are you going to hang it for people to see it? And always start from who are you trying to engage, and if you put yourself in their shoes, would they feel attacked, judged, defensive, or feel like this is oversimplistic, or would they think it was something, would they misunderstand it completely? We have to put ourselves in other people's shoes to not just have that default of they're awful and they need to change their ways, which we know in every other part of life, not to have a tantrum and scream and shout at people. But when it comes to injustice, we often forget to put ourselves in the shoes of the power holders or even the perpetrators of something awful. It's really hard to do and to not demonize them and to say, okay, where's this coming from? What's the best way to engage them, even if I do disagree with them? And that's why the word is so important in terms of all of our gentle protest language in the book. It's based on Marshall Rosenberg's nonviolent communication, but it also includes my research on using questions instead of comments, using little dots, what fonts to use, not using words like should but could, and encouraging, not demanding. And that's often what is the most disarming with our work when we're engaging politicians or board members or CEOs, is it's so much harder for them to discredit or dismiss because they can read that we've really tried to empathise with them, and we're hoping the best in them, but we're also realistic and pragmatic that we're not going to be naive and think that they're not going to do anything. But it is that balance of that gentleness of not being passive or weak or naive, but being empathetic and compassionate and loving while still holding people account. So all of the language, even in the book, my poor editor, I was like, can we make sure I don't slip anywhere and use violent language? Wherever I'm talking about power holders, make sure I'm saying everywhere this is about encouraging, not demonizing, and not fighting, but, addressing. So trying to practice what I preach. But I slip up all the time, which is why I think with every craftivist, whether you're on your own or in a group, get people to check the language before you stitch it and say, if I was someone walking past, would I understand this? If I was a power holder receiving it, would I understand this? If I'm going to look at this object I've made for myself, to remember, am I going to wince every time I look at it and feel judged, or is it genuinely going to encourage me in a positive way? And use people as a sort of springboard to check the language works for you.
Yeah, call in rather than call out, I think you say in the book.
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, gosh. I wonder, this is a book of many beautiful and brilliant parts. I mean, it is exactly that, a handbook. It's got lots of case studies. You already mentioned Dr. Danby Kim from MIT on neuroscience. It's got sort of prompts and all sorts. I think you yourself say it's a tapestry woven from threads. I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about the process of pulling all those threads together.
Yeah, it was amazing and exhausting. My last book took 10 months to write. Good methodology book, a few images in it, but it's a nice story of how to do it. And I thought, well, this one's just a project book. It'll be quicker to do. And I had in my mind, I knew I wanted a collage for different projects people have already done. There's some new projects in there, but for the ones that people have already taken part in, I wanted people to see people from all over the world taking part, different ages, backgrounds, even different views. You don't have to agree with all of the points in the book and all of the issues. And I say in the book, you might use this handbook to create projects I don't agree with the issue, and that's democracy and that's life. But it was really hard. So every project has a why to before the how to steps. So it's an essay. It's about 800 words. It was harder to write. I mean, you know this, and I'm sure lots of listeners know this, but I forgot. It's harder to write short, succinct pieces than longer. And so that was hard. And then I've got other essays throughout. And I do think I've delivered it, but I really went in with the goal of not only the images and the quotes being as diverse as possible for people to see themselves in different people, but I wanted all of the references and citations to be from accessible people and books that you could find out more, and again, different voices and backgrounds. So it took me a long time to sort of curate who I wanted voices to be in there and whose books I thought were accessible for anyone to take part in. But I really wanted to refer to psychologists, to activism experts, to people from different contexts to say how gentle protest works for them. I mentioned the importance of soft power. I talk about how Margaret Heffernan wrote a book called Uncharted, who talks about how activism isn't linear. It's really unusual. And I love that I've quoted her near the end, because my hope is that people might go and read her book then and read even more about different activists doing different things. But because I wanted to curate it in that way with the different voices, the different citations and references, the every page is in colour. I picked my own team of photographer, illustrator, designer, so that it was very visual, but it also was sort of talked about theory as well as the practice, and the visuals and aesthetics of it as well as the strategy. It was hard, but I did love it. I'm saying that now. During the process, I had many wobbles, but
that's every creative journey, though, is it not?
Is it? Okay,
I think it is. I think it is. It's sort of, you get to the point where you're too close to something. You think, am I doing it right? Is it working?
And I did cry on the last day when I got my dad to check the grammar. We were in Southwold near here.
Lovely.
And I said, just check this before I send the whole thing, because he's really good at grammar and punctuation. And he was like, yeah, change that little comma here and that. And then I just collapsed and was like, I'm just tired. Because it was like, it's fine, I'm done.
It's done. I'm glad you mentioned the books that have informed your thinking and your practice. And I did want to ask, this book is full of change makers.
Yeah.
I wonder, could you just talk us through a couple of the key ones for you, and what qualities of theirs do you try to mirror in your approach and practice, and why?
Always such
a
great
biggie.
questions, Peggy. I love it. Yeah, I mean, it was one of the joys of who can I spotlight for people to go and see. So I love Cristina Figueres. So Cristina Figueres, who's also written some brilliant books and has her own podcast, I love the way she thinks, and she's very honest about how she's always crying at big conferences about how she's worried about her daughter's future and the future of everyone. So I love that, and I think that's important to see world leaders be vulnerable. She was very honest about how she was very depressed and sceptical about whether COP can make any difference, but becoming the chair of it, she knew she had to change her mindset and be much more optimistic, and to basically practice what she's preaching and show these world leaders that she believed that they together could come up with a really robust agreement to take them forward and address climate change together. She is probably one of my heroes, one of my role models, and I've quoted her in one of the essays about the importance of practicing what you preach and wearing your heart on your sleeve, and she's actually wearing one of our green hearts you wear on your sleeve in one of the collage pages. So I'd love people to read her book that I referenced and find out more about her. But then also I have people in my mind that for me are very much examples of gentle protesters. So Sidney Poitier isn't someone that you might think of as a gentle protester, and I quote him as very much embodying this gentle way of challenging people and the importance of us making our own decisions to be good role models for people. And again, coming back to psychology and neuroscience, most of the personal change we make is through mirroring other people. So we recycle when we see other people doing it and we think, well, that looks easy to do, I'll do it. It's not by someone saying, can you recycle now, please? It's normally mirroring. And Sidney Poitier is brilliant because he made decisions on what films to make, which made sure it was about dignified black men. So he only represented people of colour where he thought they were respected, dignified. Yeah, he represented how complex humans are and how, we all contain multitudes, that lovely quote. He also did activism publicly, but he was much more about how can I present black men in a really thoughtful way and say no to characters that are stereotyped and harmful. And that was absolutely his intention of a way to protest. So I want people to think, oh, there's an amazing documentary about him and about his impact he's had in the world as an actor, but more so just as an amazing global citizen and civil rights role model. So I've got a real mix of different people in there to get people to see that activism isn't just the marches or the placards. Yeah. It's lots of more nuanced and quiet, subtle ways as well.
One of my favourite change makers that is to whom you have dedicated the book, to your grandmother, Patricia Corbett, and you credit her with putting you on this path, quote, before either of you were convinced of its potential effective impact. I wonder if you wanted to say anything to that lovely dedication.
I checked it with my dad because it's his mum. So my nan, Patricia, she passed away a couple of years ago. She's a good Glaswegian granny and then retired to Shetland, which is a very magical place, and is an incredible crafter. So she would do these very detailed, very skilled pieces of craft that were commissioned, and she'd sell and she'd make for loved ones. And it was hilarious because I remember going up to Shetland one holiday and cross-stitching these little mini banners. And she immediately said, let me look at the back. And I thought, oh, it's not very good. And she was like, why are you crafting? You're better at drawing and painting. And you're not, and she knew I just wasn't very good at it, but I explained how I think there's something in this about the aesthetics of craft, the history of craft, especially in the UK, of it being something that, you know, your grandparents have passed down, and it's very, that soft power. And she was a very intelligent woman and listened and said, okay, well, the craft isn't perfect, but, you know, I agree with you, there's something in this. And then when I was having lots of media around what I was doing, I was working full-time at Oxfam as an activism manager, and I was offered to do a big project with Save the Children and offered to do workshops and projects with museums and galleries, and we both found this really weird, like it was not planned, but she was so good at, I'd write to her all the time, and she was really good at listening and going, okay, so maybe there is something in this, and you sure you want to give up your job or go part-time to do this? But we both felt like it was something to pursue, that it was doing, one, it was doing more help than harm, which is always my default, is it doing more help than harm? And two, there seemed like there was a need for this. There were people around the world asking to join in, saying, oh, this is something I feel like would be helpful. So although it didn't look successful on paper in lots of ways in terms of financial stability, or it was hard to measure the impact, her support in letters and in person and on the phone gave me the confidence to keep going. When a lot of people around me in 2008, you know, for the first 5 years, I had activists telling me I was being too soft and this is ridiculous and this is anti-feminist. I had crafters saying, why are you bringing politics in this way into craft? This is too much. Mm-hmm. Why don't you just do fundraising or just awareness raising? It was not popular for lots of audiences. And I dedicate the book to her as that support system and as a good, tough granny. You know, she asked me the tough questions of, is this really going to have an impact? And are you sure you want to do this? And so it just felt right. And I miss her a lot. And I wanted to acknowledge her.
It's not a conversation with Sarah and Peggy if we don't speak of our grandmothers.
It's not.
And on International Women's Day, by the way, we're recording this, which is even more special. In there, Sarah, you mentioned impact. And I just wonder now, sort of many years later from when you started, do you feel different about impact now? Is it something that you perceive differently? Are there any projects in particular that stand out for having kind of made you really proud of an impact that you've had with your work?
Yeah.
10 questions in one.
I know.
Sorry.
I love it. And again, it's such a juicy question with no easy answer, isn't there? And yeah, it's really hard actually. So when I started the Craftivist Collective and was getting more demand and doing bigger projects, a lot of people said, now you need to become a charity so that you can get funding and scale up. And, you know, I had this model that worked in some ways, so you should scale it up. I didn't become a charity because it didn't make sense for the type of activism I'm doing legally. It was hard to be a charity. And also it's really hard to get funding because the impact is, it's not do X and Y will happen. And we know that as activists and just as humans, how activism, especially when you're trying to change hearts, minds, policies or laws, systems or structures, there's no easy win. And I would feel very uncomfortable pitching for funding by saying, if you give me this money, this will be the result, because we are working in a complex world where there's all these external forces and you can see impact sometimes straight away and then you fall backwards 2 steps. And I've seen it in workshops where I've given people feedback forms at the end, and during the workshop where people are thinking through their craft to thought questions that I give them with each project or having discussions, you can see people's brains working and the cogs turn. And again, because we're all in different contexts and we're all very different people, sometimes the project will lead to different things for different people. And then when I'd hand them a feedback form, you could sort of see all that exploring in their face disappear into, oh, now I've got to tick these boxes. And it felt too transactional. And I think one of the benefits of craftivism to complement other forms of activism. So I still sign online petitions. I still meet my MP without a piece of craftivism to give them. I still do op-eds and letters. I still do lots of other forms of activism that are needed and sometimes easier to measure in terms of numbers and transactions. For me, craftivism is much more about transformation, not transaction. So it's more of a catalyst for connection or conversation or change change in yourself. So all of the projects have different impact strengths and weaknesses, and that's just as important. So if you make a bit of craftivism street art, you might not be able to track the impact you're having on passers-by, but you can track the media and social media it gets, whether it's reported in books and academic articles and it's influenced other campaign organisations. I can track a lot of that. But then our handkerchiefs, which are very bespoke to an individual, so you're making it for your local politician or a board member, to build a relationship with them and commit to following what they're doing, holding them accountable, nudging them when needed if they're, not doing what you're hoping they'll do, and you want to say, why haven't you voted this way, or could you try and join in this? They're very different ways of impact. One is one-to-one and very much seeing someone as a critical friend rather than an aggressive enemy. Another is more that street art of reaching lots of people publicly. They have very different impact. Sometimes in the book, you'll see that we have helped change a law in Spain to protect migrating birds through WWF using our manifesto. We've had a school get the local provider of their juice for the kids to change so that they don't use plastics anymore. It's been really hard to make sure that the book compiles all of these different ways that you have different impact and say, try and be as strategic as possible. And then my last essay in the book says, and now let go. So it's quite, there's a lot of tension there because nothing's black and white. It's it's not either or, it's and. So be strategic and let go sometimes rather than force change on people who then feel trapped.
But that's the world we're in, isn't it? It's very complex. And this is a question I had for you. Is it we're in a deeply complex time? And I think it can feel hard to feel optimistic, can't it, when things are just really, really, really tough. I wonder then, from where do you derive your hope or get it? Or, what's that for you then?
Yeah, I really do struggle day to day with what's the point. I have an email inbox folder called my happy box. So when I am thinking, what is the point doing anything, I click it and I see emails I've got from people saying, you don't know me, but I've just read your last book and it helped me do this project, or I just bought one of your kits and now I've changed the way I decide how to buy clothes, or just to remind me again that I'm doing more help than harm. So that's always, I think, that should be the default for everyone, is where can we tweak what we're doing with our, what we buy, what we say, our mindsets, to try and be part of that vision of a more hopeful and healthy and a harmonious world for everyone, and work backwards from that. And then I limit a lot of what I read. So I read more long evergreen content books now, non-fiction books, to help me with how to be an effective activist. I read less reactive news because I know that can put me into despair rather than into action. So I sort of curate what's useful, and I'm aware that I'm not going to know everything, and I can only be useful. I can be useful in gentle craftivism. I can't be useful in trying to change the world, as I can't be a superhero. That's not good for anyone to think about.
I mean, for me, reading this book, it just opened so many doors in my brain. I just loved it. I just loved it. And I've got two questions remaining. A key thing that I took away from it was actually Figueres, who you mentioned before. It, quote, if you don't control the complex landscape of a challenge, and you rarely do, the most powerful thing you can do is change how you behave in the landscape, using yourself as a catalyst for overall change. And I thought that was a good, brisk and refreshing thing to recall. I wonder what the key learning points for you in writing this have been. Not necessarily the change makers that we mentioned before, but in the process of writing the book, what did you learn?
I think I just learned how complex social change is and how I didn't want to oversimplify it. I mean, I had 6 publishers who wanted the book, and the one I went with was the only one that would let me be complicated. I wanted essays in there and not just simple projects. I wanted collage pages. I wanted case studies. And Unbound were the only one that said, we will give you the time to write the book. It's an expensive book to make, but we agree with you. It needs to be nuanced and complex, and not lie and say, just do this and everything will be better. So I think it really helped me see how social change is hard, activism is hard, but I really want to help people try and do it in a healthy, hopeful and effective way. And we're on the journey together.
Beautiful. My final question then. This beautiful book will come out in
2nd of May.
2nd of May. How exciting. What do you hope it will do in the world then? Massive question maybe.
Massive question.
What will be a great email to put into your happy box when this book hits the shelves?
I really want people to see it as a useful tool in the activism toolkit, to say, okay, I see an issue, whether it's, talking to a neighbour who I disagree with, or where it's a big complex problem in my workplace. I want them to look at the book and go, what can I learn that I might be able to use as a form of gentle protest? Mm-hmm. And just feel like it's another useful tool in their toolbox.
A very big thank you to Sarah Corbett and to Peggy for their time. And make sure you head over to craftivist-collective.com to find out more about Sarah and her movement.
If you have any questions or you want to get in touch, you can find us at Writers Centre on Twitter and Instagram. We're on Facebook, and you can sign up to the NCW newsletter at nationalcentreforwriting.org.uk.
As a UK registered charity, we rely on the generosity of our supporters to make our work possible. You can make a donation over on our website today by clicking the Support Us button.
If you enjoyed what you heard today, please do consider subscribing to the podcast and leaving a rating and a review, because this really helps other writers to find us.
Thanks again, keep writing, and we'll catch you on the next episode.